Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series. I'm your host, Josh Malm. Our guest today is historian and Milbank Family Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, Niall Ferguson. Ferguson and I had a wide-ranging discussion about his new book, Doom, the Western world's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the flawed nature of disaster prediction, and the new Cold War between the US and China. Here's an excerpt from our discussion. How has the pandemic and the very national responses impacted great power politics or great power competition? Looking at the West, has this demonstrated strength, possibly exposed vulnerabilities, or both? And has this event served as a distraction from other ongoing security threats?
I think, and this is a key part of the last chapter of Doom, that many people initially thought this is good for China, terrible for the United States. That was a sort of standard editorial commentary of 2020, because although China had sort of started the thing, it had got it under control much more quickly than almost anybody else. And the United States had sort of blundered into a public health disaster. I was skeptical of that view when it was first proposed, because it seemed to me overrated China and underrated the US and the West generally. Because China really was to blame for the outbreak, and I don't think there's any getting around that, whether you believe it was a lab leak or not, they messed around and systematically sought to cover up the crisis in December and into January. That has, I think, harmed China's standing in the world, not only in North America, but all over Europe and indeed in Asia. And so I think China's lost a great deal of credibility in the past 18 months. I also think that the way the Chinese sought to bend the narrative with their so-called wolf warrior diplomacy was very self-destructive. It didn't work at all. In fact, I think it backfired. Meanwhile, the United States, as often in its history, having started off very badly, began to get its act together in a variety of ways that really mattered. Sure, lockdowns were a very blunt instrument, but if you do enough fiscal and monetary effort, make enough effort, you can offset the shock and have a relatively compressed economic crisis. And the US has come roaring out of the pandemic economically to the point that we're now debating if it's overheating or not. A problem I think we would have happily welcomed if you'd offered it to us a year ago. Secondly, on vaccines, the China talks a big game. They were going to save the world with their vaccines. Guess what? The vaccines have such low efficacy at this point that countries that have used them, from Mongolia to Chile, are finding that they actually haven't stopped case numbers going up. Whereas the best vaccines have come from, respectively, the US and Germany, and with the UK AstraZeneca vaccine, not that far behind Moderna and Pfizer. So I think on those big issues of how do you manage the economic shock, how do you get to a vaccine that really works? China's actually done less well than people expected last year. And I think Doom was right to foresee that and to see that ultimately the US, even with Trump still as president, was doing better by the end of the summer of 2020, the beginning of the fall, than most commentators acknowledged at the time. I've argued for more than 2 years that we're already in the early stages of Cold War II. I quite liked Henry Kissinger's phrase, the foothills of a Cold War. That was back in November of 2019, and the pandemic's only made it more obvious. I think we're out of the foothills now, and it feels like we're in some quite significant peaks. Of course, this could be very different from Cold War I. I think it will be very different. We could get to détente much faster than we did in Cold War I. But right now, it seems to me pretty clear that COVID has made the Cold War more intense, has widened the gap between the US and China, has cut China off to an extent that many people don't appreciate. I don't know when China can reopen to foreign travel. They're vaccinating like crazy, but if the vaccines don't work against the Delta variant, they're going to have to stay closed indefinitely. So I think this is really a very important turning point in US-China relations. Cold War II had begun, but I think this has brought it out into the open for many people, including many Europeans who were against the idea of Cold War, or at least of a US-China rivalry, now they realize, and that was, I think, pretty obvious at the G7, that the Europeans don't really have a choice. They can't be non-aligned, and they certainly can't line up with China. And with Trump gone and Biden in the White House, it suddenly seems a lot easier to have a transatlantic strategy with respect to China. So I think this is pretty important. I don't know how the Chinese can really get back to where they were pre-pandemic because of the reputational damage and because of all the kind of shifts that have happened in the rest of the world. I guess even in Canada, attitudes to China have shifted in the last 18 months because it's happened everywhere in the developed world, as well as in some important developing countries like India, to an extent that I don't think is widely appreciated. China's now quite isolated diplomatically. It's kind of been how to lose friends and alienate people the last 18 months of Beijing's policies. And they've realized a bit late that this is not really the way to play a Cold War. Cold War I was decided partly by the superiority of the American alliance system. And I think this will also be true in Cold War II, even if it's a different kind of alliance system in which NATO is less important and Asian partners are more important.